Welcome back to the Deep Dive, brought to you by Reformed Thinking. We're here because, like us, you want to move past all the noise, the feeling of just being overwhelmed with information, and get to some real, well-informed clarity. And today, we're doing what might be the single most critical deep dive we've ever done. We're going to be decoding the essential tools, the tools you need to understand the communication conventions the biblical authors were actually using.
It's such necessary work. When
Yeah.
people open the scriptures, they often come with this subconscious pattern of interpretation. They just assume the text speaks directly to their world in their language based on their cultural rules.
Right, as if it were written yesterday in Ohio.
Exactly. So our task really is to take those subconscious patterns, pull them into the light, analyze them, and bring them up to a conscious level. We have to be intentional in our interpretation because the mission is, well, it's simple in theory, but incredibly difficult across time. Discovering the meaning the authors really sought to convey.
And that idea right there, authorial intent, that has to be our guiding star, our North Star. We're not looking for some kind of secret meaning or hidden code.
Not at all.
We're operating from the principle that the scriptures were adequately communicated. They were meant to be understood by their original audience. But for us, thousands of years and cultures away, that original clarity, it needs a disciplined recovery.
And that recovery process is what we call hermeneutics. It rests on five inseparable components. I like to think of them as five essential pillars that have to support any valid interpretation.
Okay.
If your reading of a passage conflicts with even one of these pillars, well, you've likely missed the point the writer was trying to make.
And those five pillars are literary context, historical cultural background, word meanings, grammatical relationships, and literary genre. Let's jump in and start unpacking what it means to rely on all five. So the ultimate aim, as you said, is authorial intent. We're aiming for the specific thoughts the inspired writers were trying to communicate to the first people who read their work. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward. Why does the distance, the time and culture between us and them make this recovery process so complicated?
It all comes down to shared knowledge. The foundational assumption we have to make is that the writers wrote to be understood. They wanted the people receiving the message to get it.
Paul wasn't writing to the Romans hoping some professor in 2025 would finally crack his code.
Not at all. He wrote to people in Rome, his contemporaries, people who knew his voice, his frame of reference. So the reason we need these, complex interpretive methods isn't because the Bible is obscure. It's because we have a deficiency. We lack that shared context.
You've called this the problem of perspective, or reading over the shoulder. Can you walk us through what that actually looks like in practice?
Sure. Imagine two people texting each other today. They might reference a meme or a local politician or just an inside joke they share. The text itself might be really short because they share this immense amount of cultural, historical, and experiential background.
They're on the same page.
They're contemporaries, their perspective is aligned,
Yeah.
so the writer almost never needs to make that background explicit in the text.
Yeah, they're not stopping to write a footnote for a future reader to explain what FOMO means. They
No.
just assume the person on the other end gets the whole picture.
Precisely. Now, fast forward 2,000 years and we come along and pick up that text. We're reading the ancient equivalent of a personal, specific, context-dependent letter like Paul's letter to the Galatians, for instance. We just don't have the cultural and historical shorthand they shared. We are literally reading over the shoulders of the original audience.
So what's the solution?
It's why we have to actively work to place ourselves in the position of that ancient audience. We have to try to see the text and the world through their eyes, acknowledging what they knew and, just as critically, what they valued.
But this isn't just about, memorizing facts and dates, is it? You mentioned that our interpretation has to align with the ancient mindset, and that affects how they processed emotional content. That sounds like it requires more than a history book. It sounds like it requires a real leap of empathy.
It absolutely does. The mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It includes the whole mental attitude, the value system, the worldview of that ancient culture. And this system, it regulated the what you could call the affective dimension of discourse, how statements landed emotionally, the feeling dimension.
Okay.
A word that feels totally neutral to us might have been deeply insulting or maybe highly complimentary to them. We have to try to recapture that emotional resonance.
Give us the fox example again. This is where that cultural gap really hits home.
Okay, take Jesus' reference to Herod Antipas as a fox in Luke chapter 13. For you and me today, the word fox generally brings up positive traits, right? Like being clever, cunning, maybe a bit sly or
You
elusive.
are sly as a fox.
So if we read Jesus as calling Herod clever, the message is one of sort of uh, grudging respect mixed with caution.
But if we impose that modern value on the text, we completely miss Jesus's actual intent.
And that's the danger. In first-century Jewish culture, especially when you look at the surrounding rabbinic literature, the fox was typically a symbol of, well, low cunning, pettiness, and insignificance.
Not a powerful animal.
No, not at all. When you contrasted it with a major figure like a lion, the fox was just dismissed as minor and weak. So Jesus wasn't complimenting Herod's masterful political strategy. He was most likely dismissing him as a petty schemer. He was reducing his threat to something small and annoying.
So the intended emotional effect was one of dismissal, maybe even a little contempt, not respect.
That's it. The meaning is radically altered. If we read it as, tell that powerful, cunning ruler I'll be busy, we've just missed the point entirely. The meaning has to be closer to, tell that insignificant little schemer I don't fear his small machinations.
That's fascinating because it proves you can know all the historical facts, but if you miss the value system that's attached to a term, you still get the communication wrong.
Exactly. The risk we run constantly is imposing our current cultural values, our 21st century ethics, our worldview, onto an ancient biblical term. And that imposition just completely obscures the authorial intent. It robs the text of its original punch. We always have to be asking, what was the feeling and the value associated with this idea in the original era?
And that sets us up perfectly for our first major pillar, historical cultural background. This is so much more than trivia. It's the stage upon which the whole drama of redemption unfolds.
The primary principle here is it's a crucial validity test. The correct interpretation must be consistent with the historical cultural background of the passage. We need to be able to look at any suggested interpretation and ask a few questions. Could this idea have been inconsistent with, or maybe inconceivable in, or just plain anachronistic in the original setting?
Anachronistic meaning it just wouldn't have fit in that time period.
Right. If the answer is yes, then the interpretation is almost certainly invalid. We can't, for instance, interpret a passage to mean something that requires, say, medieval concepts of alchemy or modern concepts of particle physics. It just doesn't work.
So this study of the ancient setting serves several functions. We've talked about understanding the original communicator's perspective and grasping the mindset. What's the third reason this historical pillar is so crucial?
The third reason connects directly to contextualization, that difficult but necessary task of accurately expressing the biblical message in our contemporary culture. This is the moment where the interpreter really has to successfully straddle two worlds, the ancient biblical world and our current modern society.
We need interpretive bifocals.
That's a perfect analogy. The first lens, it looks back. It focuses exclusively on the biblical world, working to perceive what the message meant originally. This is the hard work of exegesis, defining the fixed intended meaning.
And then the second lens looks forward.
That's right. The forward-looking lens determines how best to express, how to contextualize that sense for today's hearers. And the key is making sure that the message conveys the same sense and, critically, the same emotional impact it had on the original audience. Exegesis defines the meaning. Contextualization finds the appropriate modern language and imagery to communicate that meaning without changing it.
When you talk about fixing the intended meaning, that sounds like our best defense against syncretism.
It is the absolute safeguard. If we allow the original meaning to be fluid or undefined, we inevitably drift into syncretism. That's the blending of biblical truths with non-biblical, culturally acceptable ideas, and what you get is a hybrid sub-Christian religion.
So we remake the Bible in our own image.
In a sense, yes. If we fail to establish the fixed meaning based on the ancient setting, we end up recasting the message according to our 21st century values. Proper contextualization uses contemporary concepts to communicate the Bible's message, but it doesn't allow contemporary values to define that message.
Let's apply that validity test again, because the stakes here are really high. The classic example is the church in Laodicea from Revelation chapter 3, the condemnation of being lukewarm.
Most modern readers, they default to a metaphor where hot is good, passionate, zealous for God. Cold is bad, active opposition, rejection of God. And lukewarm is the worst of all, apathetic, indifferent.
And our interpretation then becomes a warning against half-hearted Christianity.
Right. And while that spiritual lesson might be true in principle, the question is, does it align with the actual historical context of Laodicea?
And the answer is no.
It does not. The local geography is absolutely essential here. Laodicea received its water through an aqueduct. Nearby, the city of Hierapolis had these renowned hot springs, famous for their medicinal and beneficial properties. So hot was useful.
Okay.
On the other hand, Colossae had desirable, refreshing cold water streams. So cold was also useful. Both were highly desirable resources.
But the water that traveled that long distance to Laodicea arrived in a middle state.
Exactly. It was lukewarm. By the time it got there, it was no longer hot enough to be medicinal, nor was it cold enough to be refreshing. It was useless. And famously, it was known to induce nausea.
So Jesus' condemnation wasn't that they were not trying hard enough?
No, it was that they were utterly useless and repulsive, ready to be spit out.
Wow. So every time I've read that passage, I've been fundamentally missing the point. The condemnation refers to uselessness, not some kind of middle ground on a spiritual temperature scale. If we suggest that active opposition, being cold, is somehow better than being lukewarm, that interpretation just fails the validity test. It's inconsistent with the original setting, where both hot and cold water were good things. The background just flips the entire metaphor on its head.
It really shows the absolute necessity of this pillar. And this leads us back to something we mentioned earlier. Determining the original impact, the perlocution, the emotional force. We need to know the emotional reaction the message would have had.
The force of the text. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is the best example of this.
It really is. We read it today, and it's a lovely story about helping strangers. But for Jesus' Jewish audience, the term Samaritan was despised. It was a term of revulsion. It was associated with religious impurity and national enmity.
So when Jesus made the Samaritan the hero of the story, the only one who displayed true neighborliness, he wasn't trying to make his listeners feel warm and fuzzy.
No, he was deliberately provoking them. The intent was shock, maybe even fury, that a member of a despised ethnic group would be held up as the moral superior to respected religious figures like the priest and the Levite.
So if we miss that extreme cultural contempt that was attached to the word Samaritan, we miss the radical point that true love of neighbor just transcends all ethnic, social, and religious barriers. The impact was revolutionary, not comforting.
It was. And to do this kind of investigative work, we have to research all the background factors. General things like the writer, the recipients, the date, the purpose, and also specific factors like the worldview, the economy, societal structures, religious practices. This historical and cultural research has to always support our understanding of the text. It must not become a separate message that overrides the plain sense.
Okay, so if the historical setting is the stage, then literary context pillar 2. That's the script and the internal structure. Many scholars argue this is the single most important principle of hermeneutics. Why does literary context rank so highly?
Because it controls everything internal to the text itself. It governs our understanding of individual words, and it's the key determiner for the meaning of the complete statement. Literary context is simply the material immediately surrounding the passage we're studying. If you rip the passage away from its context, you create a meaning the author never ever intended.
Let's look at the 3 guiding principles for using literary context. First, you say that context establishes the flow of thought.
Think about writing a comprehensive paper. You organize your thoughts sequentially, right? You build ideas upon previous points to lead the reader to a conclusion. Taking a passage out of that sequence violates the writer's entire argument structure. So our interpretation has to align with the writer's train of thought. How does this sentence function in the paragraph? And how does this paragraph function in the entire argument? If we interrupt that logical flow, we lose the writer's point.
And the most dangerous way this gets violated is through proof texting, just elevating a single verse to be its own independent unit.
It is an immense danger.
Yeah.
We use chapter and verse numbers for ease of location, but they're not God-breathed. They were added much, much later. When we quote Psalm 14.1 as merely, "there is no God," we completely distort the author's communication.
Right, because the full sentence has to be read.
The full sentence, "Fools say in their hearts, there is no God." The context identifies the speaker as the fool, not the psalmist making some grand theological pronouncement.
You brought up another example, quoting Luke 4.6, where a statement is made about who controls the domain and glory of the world.
Right. Luke 4.6 says, "I will give you all this domain and its glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I give it to whomever I wish." If you quote that in isolation, it sounds like a very authoritative claim. But the literary context of that temptation scene demands that we identify the speaker. It's the devil.
So reading that statement without identifying the context, the speaker fundamentally changes the meaning, the authority, and the truth value of the sentence.
Completely. The literary context is the guardian of the author's intention.
The second principle is that context provides the accurate meaning of words. You mentioned that most words have a range of possible meanings, so the context acts as a narrowing agent.
It's just simple language mechanics. If I use the word set, it can mean a collection of objects, a stage backdrop, hardening concrete, or the lowering of the sun. The context determines which meaning is active. If we read the sentence, "That was the largest trunk I ever saw," the surrounding material, talk of elephants or trees or travel, tells us immediately which of the multiple meanings of trunk is intended. We're not free to just arbitrarily choose a meaning we prefer. We have to choose the one demanded by the literary environment.
And the third principle is that context shows the correct relationships among units.
Yeah, sentences, paragraphs, larger sections of text, they all have to be understood in relationship to the whole argument of the book. We have to understand how the small parts contribute to the development of the overall theme. If a passage is an explanation, we treat it as an explanation. If it's a proof, we treat it as a proof. We need to see how the writer has organized their material to develop their case.
This brings us to literary genre, which is Pillar 3, and the appropriate unit of thought. How does the type of writing change how we approach the structure?
For prose like, the vast majority of the epistles or the narrative accounts in the Gospels, the basic unit of thought is normally the paragraph. The focus has to be on the paragraph's theme and structure, rather than zooming in immediately on a single word or a single verse. Concentrating on the paragraph significantly increases our chances of capturing the accurate meaning, because we're following the author's idea as it develops.
But other genres require different units.
Absolutely. If we're dealing with poetry, the unit of thought might be couplets or stanzas. If it's a complex parable, the unit is often the entire parable itself. An oracle, the entire oracle. We have to always respect the literary rules, the conventions that the author used for that specific genre. You just don't read the metaphors in prophecy the same way you read the historical details in the book of Acts.
Let's detail the contextual hierarchy, these circles of study, because moving through the layers in the right order seems vital for discipline.
We proceed from the center outward. We start with what has the most control over the meaning, and then we move toward what has the least specific control. And this hierarchy, it helps defend against our own personal bias, because it forces the interpreter to prioritize the local immediate meaning before seeking theological confirmation from broader sources.
The inner and most important circle is the immediate context.
This is the material right before and right after the passage. It has the most important control. We have to understand the theme and structure of this immediate section. What did the writer just say, and what are they about to say? How does this passage function as a piece of that puzzle?
Then, moving outward, we find the book context.
This requires understanding the entire book, its controlling themes, its purpose, its basic outline. Knowing the book's purpose sets necessary limits on the meaning of its individual parts. For example, if you are studying James's definition of saving faith in chapter 2, you must consult his other uses of the word faith throughout that single letter to ensure you're being consistent.
Next up is the author's corpus of writings context.
If the same writer wrote other books, we look there next. This provides really high linguistic and conceptual continuity. If we're trying to grasp Paul's concept of redemption in Romans, it's most beneficial to consult Galatians or Ephesians, which were written by the same mind and often cover related themes.
Then we have the pertinent Testament context.
Parallels within the same testament, old or new, but by different writers. OT writers shared common traditions and convictions, like the Mosaic Law or the Davidic monarchy. NT writers shared the age of messianic fulfillment and Greek linguistic patterns. This level is helpful, but it offers less specific insight than the inner circles.
And finally, the largest circle, the Bible context.
This is the entire canon of 66 books. Because we affirm the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we recognize Scripture possesses an overall unity. Therefore, the correct sense of any single passage will be consistent with the rest of Scripture's teaching on that subject. But this is a consistency check. It's the final boundary. It actually offers the least amount of specific insight for the particular passage you're studying. We don't use the entire Bible to define a word that can be defined by the paragraph. We use the entire Bible to ensure our defined word doesn't contradict established doctrine.
All right, let's move to the building blocks themselves. Word meanings, which is Pillar 4. The central rule here is that accurate interpretation requires the meaning demanded by the normal meaning of the words in the context in which they occur.
Right. If the foundation is shaky, the whole house falls. Misunderstanding a crucial word can just derail an entire line of reasoning. And word study isn't just for scholars, it's for every disciplined reader. We could break it down into 3 essential steps.
Okay, step 1. Select the words that require detailed analysis. We don't need to look up every single term, do we?
No, of course not. The meaning of most words is clear enough from the context. We focus on the heavy lifters or the tricky spots. This includes, difficult theological terms like justify, redeem, or covenant. It also includes crucial words whose meaning dictates the passage's overall message. Rare words, maybe ones that only occur once. A hapax legomenon, words that are repeated frequently, which signals the author's special focus. Figurative words, and any term where English translations significantly diverge. That usually suggests some ambiguity in the original language.
Step 2 is the deep dive into meaning. Synchronic analysis. We have to secure the meaning of the word specifically at the time the text was written to defend against anachronism.
This is so vital. We consult lexicons to understand the range of possible meanings that were available to the author at that time. We also have to recognize that words exist in a semantic field, a collection of related terms or synonyms. Understanding this field helps us grasp the subtle nuances of the word we're studying. For instance, the Greek word agape is often set against philia for brotherly love, or eros for romantic love. Understanding those related terms really sharpens our definition of agape.
And we absolutely have to resist false etymologies. This seems like one of the most common mistakes people make when they're trying to sound knowledgeable.
It's endemic. Just because a word sounds similar to a modern one, we cannot assume that the ancient meaning is preserved. The classic example is the Greek word for power, dynamis. It's often wrongly claimed that Paul meant dynamite when he spoke of the dynamis of God, just because our English word derived from it.
That's just reading history backward.
Completely. Dynamite didn't exist in the first century. We must never read later meanings into an earlier biblical use. A word means what it meant then, not what it means now.
For New Testament readers, the influence of the Septuagint, the LXX, is crucial here. Why does the Greek translation of the Old Testament complicate things?
It provides theological weight. The LXX was, for all intents and purposes, the Bible of the early church. And over centuries of translation and use, certain Greek terms acquired new religious or theological nuances derived from their Hebrew background. For instance, the common Greek word kyrios, just means sir, master, or owner, was used in the LXX to translate the sacred and powerful name Yahweh.
So when the New Testament writers call Jesus Kyrios Lord, that word is carrying centuries of theological weight referring to the deity of the Old Testament.
Exactly. If we only consult secular Greek texts, we miss that colossal theological distinction. We miss the fact that calling Jesus Kyrios was an affirmation of his divinity, far beyond just a title of polite respect. We have to recognize how the history of religious usage enriched the meaning of those Greek terms.
Let's use the concept of peace to show how context narrows the range of meaning. You compare the Hebrew shalom and the Greek eironium.
Sure. Shalom is a very broad concept. Prosperity, completeness, harmony, well-being, a sense of unimpaired relationships. The Greek eironion is similarly broad. It can cover both the external absence of hostility and internal tranquility. Now consider Jesus' promise of peace in John 14:27. He tells his disciples, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you."
And then only 2 chapters later, he explicitly warns them about external conflict.
Right. In John 16:33, he says, "In the world you have trouble," or hostility. Since the context immediately contradicts the possibility of external peace or an absence of hostility, the context demands that Jesus' promise refers to the internal tranquility and well-being that God provides. It's a peace the world cannot give, and a peace external circumstances cannot shatter. The literary context is the supreme arbitrator. It selects the one correct meaning from the semantic range.
Which brings us to step 3. Select the meaning that best fits the context.
And this step requires humility. The chosen meaning must fit seamlessly with the immediate literary context and the historical cultural background. We have to resist the temptation to impose a preferred meaning based on our personal theological system or a desired application. Our role is to ensure the word means what the text demands, not what we prefer it to mean. The context defines the word. The word doesn't define the context.
Okay, the 5th and final pillar. This covers the mechanics of language, grammatical relationships, and structure. Grammar governs how words are organized to express thought. Every passage has to be interpreted consistently with its grammar.
Grammar includes morphology word forms and syntax word combinations. When we perform what's called structural analysis, we are tracing the precise flow of thought and argument. This requires distinguishing the main statement, the independent clause, from all the subordinate clauses that qualify it or explain it or modify it.
That sounds incredibly painstaking. Why is that level of detail so necessary?
Because the grammar reflects the author's intentional communication strategy. If a clause begins with the word because, the author intends to give a reason. If it says so that, the author intends to show purpose or result. We have to identify all these structural relationships: chronological sequences, thematic groups, logical connections like causation, comparison, and contrast. If we misidentify a dependent clause as the main idea, we distort the entire passage.
And the impact of verbs is massive here, particularly when translating from Greek or Hebrew, where nuances are so often lost in English.
Verbs carry the entire way to action. Mood is a command, a statement, a wish, time, voice, and perhaps most critically aspect, the kind of action.
Take the Greek perfect tense. When 1 John speaks of what we have heard, which we have seen, the perfect tense doesn't just describe a past event. It signifies an ongoing state of affairs that results from a completed action.
So it's not just we saw Jesus once. It's more like we saw Jesus and we are currently living in the resultant state of having been eyewitnesses, making our testimony true right now.
That's the subtlety. The theological claim is far stronger than a simple historical report. It's an assertion of continuing validity based on a past fact. Another subtle example is the present imperative of prohibition. In English, we just say, do not do X.
But in Greek, the form can signal either a command to never start an action or a command to stop an action that's already in progress.
Precisely. The command in 1 John 4.1, do not believe every spirit, could carry the force of, stop believing every spirit. This grammatical detail tells us something about the audience. They were already prone to gullibly accepting false teachings, and the author is commanding them to cease that activity. If we miss the aspect of the verb, we miss the diagnosis of the audience's existing problem.
We also have to pay extremely close attention to connectives, the conjunctions. These are often the smallest words, but carry the greatest logical weight.
Connectives like therefore, accordingly, however, or because, they are the hinges of the argument. They regulate the logical flow. Ignoring, therefore, means ignoring the logical inference drawn from the preceding verses. Ignoring a conversely or a however means missing the contrast the author is setting up. These little words define reason, purpose, time, or contrast, and ignoring them results in the swift dismantling of the writer's line of reasoning.
And finally, let's look at the significance of pronouns and number. Specifically, the singular versus plural distinction in the word you. This is often entirely invisible in our English translations.
It is the grammatical distinction most often obscured, yet it is absolutely crucial for proper application. Greek and Hebrew clearly distinguish between a singular you and a plural you. Failing to recognize this difference radically changes whether the passage applies corporately to the church or individually to the person.
The example in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and chapter 6 is extremely clear on this.
In 1 Corinthians 3.16 and 17, Paul is addressing deep divisions within the Corinthian church. When he says, do you not know that you, and that's plural, yourselves, are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you again, plural? The grammatical plurality reveals that the church as a corporate body is the temple of God. His plea is against divisions that destroy the collective body.
Then, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he's addressing sexual immorality, and he shifts.
He shifts dramatically. He uses the singular pronoun when he says, your singular body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, singular. The message here is about individual piety and personal responsibility regarding sin. Overlooking that singular plural distinction leads to a misapplication of the earlier warning in chapter 3. It often reduces Paul's corporate plea for unity to just a general call for individual purity, which misses the entire point of the structural warning against division.
That distinction is monumental. It shows that even tiny grammatical details matter. You also mentioned the relative pronoun in Matthew's genealogy.
Right. Consider Matthew 1.16, which recounts the lineage leading to Jesus. It says Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. The relative pronoun, whom in the Greek text is feminine and singular. This grammatical precision restricts the antecedent to Mary alone. This small detail, confirmed by the grammar, reinforces the virgin birth account and clarifies the theological point that Jesus is the child of Mary only, not of both Joseph and Mary. Grammatical analysis often safeguards the most essential theological points.
This deep dive has really shown that intentionality is the key to clarity. We can't come to the text unprepared. We have to bring this robust toolkit, the 5 pillars: history, culture, literary context, word meanings, grammar, and genre, to move beyond a superficial reading and confidently discover the author's intent.
And when we apply these pillars diligently, we ensure that we're reading the author's message, not just our own assumptions. And as those who affirm the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, we acknowledge that the Spirit provides continuity to the entire canon. That means the correct sense of any single passage will always align with the rest of Scripture's teaching on that subject. Our goal is clarity, accuracy, and relevance for the church today.
To close our deep dive, let's return to that tension between historical context and the plain meaning of the text, using the challenging parable of the unjust steward in Luke chapter 16. The manager, he's about to be fired, and he cleverly reduces the debts of his master's debtors to secure favors for himself. And then the master compliments him for his shrewdness, not his honesty.
hmm Many interpreters today, using historical cultural background research, explain this by arguing that the steward was simply eliminating the exorbitant illegal interest rates the master had charged. Therefore, his action was actually one of justice, restoring fair practices, and so Jesus is truly commending justice, even if he used the word shrewdness.
But wait a minute. If we rely strictly on the literary context, the text explicitly states the owner complimented the manager for his shrewdness or cleverness. Nothing in the surrounding verses mentions unjust interest rates, nor is the theme of the passage justice. Jesus' application to his disciples stresses that they should be equally shrewd in using present resources to secure eternal rewards.
And this raises a critical boundary question for every serious interpreter. The historical background material might explain why the steward's shrewdness worked without legal repercussions. It supports the context. But we have to be cautious not to let external background material supplant the plain meaning of the text, which is a complement of his clever resourcefulness. If we make the historical background the primary theme, justice, when the text's literary context states a different theme, shrewdness, we risk overruling the author's intended communication strategy.
So I have to ask ourselves, how often do we allow contextual background material to become an explanation that replaces the explicit theme of the text, rather than letting it simply support and illuminate the intended meaning? Even when that intended meaning challenges our ethical expectations, it's a constant discipline to let the text speak, supported but not overridden by its surrounding world.